Revelationary on Air with Brian Knapp and Dr. Chris Bolt.
Hello and welcome to Revelationary on Air. I'm Brian Knapp. With me is Chris Bolt and our mystery, well, not really mystery guest. You were a mystery guest for a while. Conley Owens. Now he's gone. Oh, look at that. Conley's like technology challenged, apparently. Which
Start
is
out
kind
with
of...
magic.
I was being the mystery guest.
Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, I think you're the third guest we've had in the last, if I'm counting right, no, the fourth guest. Yeah. That's not really relevant to any of this, though, so I'm just going to skip right over that. So today, I think our topic is reacting to Fesco. For those of you, for those, oh, he's got it. See, I have the Kindle version, and I literally.
That's what we're going to do tonight, right?
We're going to turn it upside down.
That's right. That's right.
So I'm not going to be as involved in this discussion as I would like to be, just because I only just read 2 of the chapters today, and specifically where Fesco talks about the transcendental argument and then talks about Presupp and Van Til and the whole idea of worldview. Am I remembering this stuff? I think I am. But let me... Conley, just take a moment and talk about yourself, a short moment. Let people know what you're up to, what you've been working on over the past few years, and then we'll go ahead and dig in.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Conley Owens. I'm a pastor at Silicon Valley Reformed Baptist Church. And boy, I don't know what else to say by way of introduction. I have a wife and 7 kids.
Wow.
Yeah. Anything else you think I should mention? Otherwise, I'll just start talking about my history with Presupp.
He's forgotten his name. I mean, he's forgotten everything about himself because he's a busy man.
Chris, do you want to talk about him for a minute?
I don't know if I can or not. Wasn't Conley one of our contributors for a short while in some form or fashion?
I made at least 2 posts, I think, and I talked about doing 2 others that I never did. So.
So a little bit of presuppositional acumen there. And then you've done some work with a particular cult. I'll let you pronounce it and maybe just say a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure.
And maybe we can have you on sometime in the future to talk more about that.
Yeah, so the Galatian Ni Christo, they became a little more well-known in our circles after their debate with James White. Yeah, they're a very large cult in the Philippines. And when I say cult, that word is like tricky with certain groups. They check all the boxes, really. They constitute about 2.5 to 5% of the population of the Philippines. So it's a rather large organization. You meet 20 people, one of them very likely would be INC. Yeah, and they deny the deity of Christ. They deny that you can understand the Bible without one of their ministers explaining it to you. They deny salvation by faith alone, etc. A lot of things like that.
Wow. You're kind of the preeminent apologist on that topic, at least before they became more popular or well known. I think have there been some TV shows, documentaries about that group fairly recently?
They have produced their own things in the past couple of years. I'm not aware if there's anything new, but there are scholars who have done academic dissertations on them, but they, as well as other apologists, often focus on social aspects, like the fact that they practice block voting. They interpret 1 Corinthians 1:10 says, "Be of one judgment," to mean you have to vote like we tell you. And this has a lot of implications since they control such a large portion of the population. Yeah. And there's just a lot of social things that scholars are very interested in exploring, and apologists often are very interested in exploiting, which is kind of understandable. You want to show these various kinds of corruption, but that means that a lot of them aren't aren't actually focused on showing theological errors.
Sure. And then the last question on that, the gentleman you referenced, James R. White, and his debate with one of their representatives. Did I read somewhere that gentleman passed away?
So I am myself confused, because I was pretty sure that I remember on Facebook there being posts on his wall where someone was posting for him saying that he had passed from COVID early on in the pandemic, and saw confirmations of this. And then there was nothing on his wall. And I don't know if these are all false memories, but now someone is posting for him, or he is posting again. And
he's back.
So I just don't know. I really don't know. I've not seen any live video of him since that. But I feel thrown a little for the loop.
Yeah, that's kind of bizarre. Well, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Thanks for coming on, Conley.
Yeah.
And I apologize for missing your emails. I legitimately was on the road from about the end of May all the way through like the first or second week of July. So I was running around with my hair on fire.
This is what Chris has been saying at the beginning of each show we've done.
Yes.
Has
For
only
the
been
past,
2.
I don't know how long now.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
but
Right.
yeah. So
I'd love to correspond with you more about that later. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe I didn't miss my opportunity. Maybe this is what this is. I don't know. I posted one day on social media about grace, and I was like, there was I don't know, it was some analogy with grace or whatever, and I was like, this is what grace is like. And what I was actually talking about, even though I didn't say it, was that I had been granted an extension on an academic deadline. So, but anyway, yes.
Sounds good.
Are you really done now? Cool.
I think so, unless Conley wants to plug that project.
No, it's all right. Yeah, well, maybe I will. Yeah, I'm publishing a book called The Dorian Principle. It'll be available on September 30th, and you can sign up to get notified at dorian.church. And yeah, it's a book about ministry fundraising ethics. Yeah, the subtitle is A Biblical Response to the Commercialization of Christianity.
Nice.
Ooh.
Very nice.
Always a good subject, always timely, unfortunately. So, okay. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about Presupp. No surprise there. And for those of you that are just arriving, Chris, can you hold the book up again? Because I think there's a couple more people here. Reforming Apologetics by J.V. Fesco. So this is a book that, okay, thank you, does some criticism of Van Til and also the transcendental argument specifically, and goes into some detail. And I know Conley has been I don't want to misrepresent you here, semi-presupper for a while. There's parts of it that you think are cool, that are good, that make sense, that are biblical. I'm going to keep putting words in your mouth until you stop me. But you're not 100% on board.
I'll stop you there. So, yeah, I can tell my whole history with it in a minute. But just, yeah, well, I feel a sense of responsibility, given that I've seen a lot of responses to Van Tilianism, to figure them out before I, am too vocal about what I think I know when I really am not sure. So this is more about due diligence than it's about doubt. But
he's given in already. See that? Just by us having him in the middle, that's intentional to put our guests in the middle so they feel the pressure.
Yeah. 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 So my whole history, yeah, I mean, back in 2011, I started to get into, little discussions online about things. And when I would talk to atheists, I would have a very, a weak response where I would say some things about, well, here are some prophecies. And then I would even admit, but like, I know that anyone could interpret these any way they wanted to, if they were already, geared to deny the faith. And it's really something God has to do in your heart. And so that's like I would consider that a very Presupp oriented thought, that I had as I was having these discussions, and, really not being happy with my apologetic toward atheists because found Choosing Hats more the chat room than the website, although the website was also helpful. and having discussions with people in there, then reading a lot of Van Til. I have read a few of his interpreters, but I think I've read all of Van Til's major works except for Common Grace, and then many of his minor works as well. And really liking everything I read, but the parts that mention, proper nouns of people or philosophies, just kind of skimming over that because I don't know what they mean. And so while I feel like I'm kind of philosophically oriented, I'm not very philosophically educated, and I've never been able to have enough pegs to hang details on as I read those things. And even as I've read Fesco's book, I've really struggled to understand what the core contentions are because I don't know the background of a lot of these things. And I was a little disappointed because I was anticipating this to try to be more geared to someone like me and not to someone already like well philosophically informed or trying to get to all these historical issues, which it's perfectly fine that he wanted to do that. It's just I just feel lost in a lot of this because I appreciated the theology I got from Van Til, but I did not understand a lot of the references to other characters throughout history, and I don't understand a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, three things that I'd like to say real quick on that. The first is that Cornelius Van Til, he would often interact with fairly obscure figures. Of course, he would, take shots and write entire books against some others who are more prominent. But he did mention a lot of contemporaries and others that a lot of us have never even heard of, right? At least until Van Til, until we read about them in Van Til. In fact, I believe it's a book. Oh, is the person's name Brown? An Introduction to Philosophy or Philosophy of Religion, something like that, by someone named Brown, I believe. I'm vaguely recalling this from the early 2000s when I read it. And I think he makes the criticism of Van Til, if this even constitutes a criticism, saying, well, he interacts with obscure interlocutors. And I'm like, why is that a critique or criticism? But so I don't think you're alone in that with as far as some of the names and all of that sort of thing. Another thing that I would say is when it comes to Fesco and his book, he's not a philosopher. I'm fairly confident he says that in the book. Kudos to him for trying to deal with some of the philosophical themes and whatnot. But he really is approaching this from the perspective of historical theology. I was not familiar with J.V. Fesco prior to this book, probably to my shame. I am acquainted with some of his friends and whatnot who have spoken very highly of him. Now, in his book, the way that he treats the topics, I think that, and I don't want to misrepresent him, so I'm hoping to fairly represent him here. He's looking at this from a very historical, theological angle, looking at the Westminster Confession of Faith, what we mean by some of these terms, and going back to the Westminster divines who actually wrote these things, who actually define, in a sense, historic Reformed theology. And not really in a sense, right? They actually do define it in terms of the Westminster Confession. And so he goes into those writers and uses what they've said in order to cast more light upon what the confession is saying with regard to these issues of things like the light of nature and that sort of thing. And so he's working from that position, I think, and then comparing and contrasting Van Til with that, as well as, of course, Thomas Aquinas and all that. He gets into idealism. There's some big themes in the book, of course, but as far as what we might consider more obscure thinkers, I don't think they're that obscure within Reformed historic thought, if that's fair. I mean, that's not exactly my area, right? I mean, I've read as much as I can, but yeah, so that would be maybe more familiar to some of those folks in those circles in a more tight sense. There was a third thing I think I was going to say, but I forget what it was now.
Well, yeah, I have at least one thing to interject here, which is that I was familiar with Fesco, and I think he's fantastic. His book on imputation is one of the, if I had to put together the top 25 books that have really impacted me, that would definitely be on there. Very good work if you're trying to study things like original sin.
Now, did he do that from a historical angle?
A lot of it was, yes. And that was, but it was very valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to throw Fesco into this category either per se, but there's a lot of this sort of approach out there that conflates historical theology with systematic theology. Like, I know they go together, and they should. I'm not saying something Baptist here for those who are really sensitive to these sorts of things. I'm not saying like throw all that out and let's go back to Wayne Grudem. I'll be that blunt about it, right? What I am saying is that we don't want to conflate historical and systematic theology so that we move from some sort of description to some sort of prescription without warrant for doing so, right? And so, again, this is like the antithesis of Fesco, so please hear me, everybody, when I say this. But someone like Dr. Dumais, who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, she is a historian. Where she's at Calvin, right? If I'm not mistaken, and I should know this. And she's writing from a historical perspective, but there seems to be a bit of, to borrow and expand a theme from philosophy, there seems to be a bit of moving from like the is to the ought, right? And so you can read a book like that, and it's funny, the reactions to a book like Jesus and John Wayne. When I read a book like that, a lot of it's just describing the things that I saw, at least from a slight distance, in my Christian upbringing, in a fairly fundamentalist upbringing. But it doesn't therefore follow that all of these connections and associations and all that sort of thing prove that this or that person is right or wrong. And so sometimes these things are just spoken like verbatim in these works, as though we're supposed to understand what the criticism or critique is, and it's not always that clear.
Yeah.
Right. So James Anderson has written a review of Fesco's book on prognosco.com.org.something.com. Yeah. We'll put a link to that in the description here in the comments for people who want to go look at it. And so when I said I read or skimmed chapters 5 and 6, I also read those two sections of Anderson's book. And so I'm somewhat familiar with what Fesco is saying. I'm more familiar with what Anderson says about it, because what he said was didn't take as much reading. Chris, before we let Conley start throwing questions at us here, what is your familiarity with the book? Have you read it? I know you've read Anderson's.
Yeah, and that was the third thing I was going to mention. So this is not going to be, at least from my perspective, I don't care what Conley or Brian do, but I mean, I do to some extent because they're my brothers, but I don't care. I don't care about them. But no, I'm not going to present like a scholarly review of Fesco, obviously. I hope that's obvious. This is a podcast. Brian and I do this off the top of our heads each week for the most part. So this is not a formal review. I do owe a lot of people a formal review of this book. I have over 50 pages of notes on this book that I did not have time to review today. There's a lot here. Also, I do have, Lord willing, a forthcoming piece on a particular part of this book, one of the themes of this book. Hopefully that print source will be coming out, but we're looking into the future, like 2022, 2023, if the Lord wills. So I do want to, though, kind of address Conley, some of his misgivings or qualms or questions or comments or criticisms or whatever, maybe per Fesco, or, maybe these are just some things that other people have thought of. But I guess a good way, though, to kind of just mention Fesco a little bit here and include his book in the discussion is to point out, and by the way, the subtitle is Retrieving the Classic Reformed Approach to Defending the Faith. So this is in a similar vein to what R.C. Sproul and John Gerstner wrote, right, with their book many, many moons ago. And the same thing, I would say, Michael Sudduth, The Reformed Objection and Natural Theology. That is, in my opinion, a fantastic book. Now, Michael Sudduth has apostatized. He is not a professing Christian anymore. But anyway, Fesco, going through this book, the chapters are titled The Light of Nature, Common Notions, Calvin, Thomas Aquinas, Worldview, Transcendental Arguments, Dualisms, and the Book of Nature and Apologetics. So the light of nature and common notions. The light of nature is a language that's used in the Confessions. The light of nature in man and the works of God plainly declare there is a God, but his word and spirit only do it fully and effectually for the salvation of sinners. So this is the phrase. What's that?
I said I have the song memorized.
This is the phrase that Fesco wants to pick up on and then run it through the Westminster Divines, especially in terms of common notions. And so this is probably the main source of disagreement or concern from Fesco's standpoint. This is probably these are probably some of the stronger chapters of the book, perhaps, just going through the history and development of these ideas. Then he's going to deal with thinkers like Calvin and Aquinas and how Van Til fits or doesn't with those, that sort of thing. And then this issue of worldview, which we can certainly discuss some, the issue of transcendental arguments, which I think we can certainly discuss. I just reread that chapter. I'm just not convinced by that chapter almost at all. I hate to say, but dualisms deals with nature and grace, which is an important theme, especially in like the Two Kingdoms. And, Graham Goldsworthy talks about this quite a bit. I'm confident that Fesco, if he doesn't do it in this book, I don't remember. I'm confident that Fesco would take issue with someone like Goldsworthy in terms of his hermeneutics and nature grace thing. And then the Book of Nature and Apologetics. And that's one thing, too, is that I think there's this idea out there. I'm not attributing this to Fesco per se, but there is a common misunderstanding out there, I think, that Van Tilians are only focused on Scripture. And like it's almost as though we don't believe in a book of nature, but we clearly do. Right. There is common grace. And but beyond that, there is general revelation, the book of nature. And of course, it does not disagree with Scripture, with special revelation. They work in tandem, as it were. They work together. They're from the same God, and they have many of the same attributes. All right. I'm going to be quiet now, but that's kind of a very quick overview of Fesco's book. And I'll turn it over to Brian, Conley, whoever.
Well, yeah, let me start off asking a question just about that, because I had only encountered the nature-grace dichotomy in Roman Catholic theology before reading this, and maybe that's, reflective of the fact that I'm not reading enough. But is that like a reasonable dichotomy to make? Because I always assumed it was something very specifically Roman Catholic, because it sounds like it does not seem like an actual dichotomy. Like a lot of things don't fit in those categories, or that they overlap too much, or I don't know.
Yeah, and honestly, Conley, I'll be very forthright. This is probably my weakest area as far as responding to this book or almost any other. It is certainly in Roman Catholicism. It's certainly there to some extent in the Thomistic type thinking. But he mentions Duyaverad. I'm just flipping through the chapter here with that. Criticisms against so-called dualisms, talking about Duyaverad. That's another common theme, I think, with critiques of Van Til, by the way, is to go back to the Amsterdam school and to kind of import a lot of that thought into Van Til. That's not completely wrong. A lot of it's there, right? But Van Til makes specific criticisms of these thinkers as well, all the way up to Abraham Kuyper and others. But the quick answer to your question is, I think that's probably a helpful set of categories to look into more, in particular in the work of Herman Bavinck, with the nature, grace, the relation between those and that sort of thing. Grace grace perfects nature. It doesn't destroy nature. These are important sorts of things, especially with regard to Two Kingdoms thinking and natural law and all that sort of thing. But I'll just be flatly honest with you, unless you can write that out as an objection against Van Til, I'm not sure how to address what you're saying.
Sure. Yeah, I've read volume 1 of Bavinck. I'll have to. I assume if it were anywhere, it would be there, but I have to look more. So yeah, let me ask you more very similar questions. And these are like really basic theology questions that are almost embarrassing to ask, but is there a difference between natural revelation and general revelation? Because I hear people use those terms, and sometimes I've heard, okay, so I have a head shake. Now, I guess follow-up question. Do these particularly have to do with revelation of who God is, or can they do with God's creation, right? So, like, for example, if I look and I see a tree and I learn that there is a tree there, is that in a sense general revelation, or is it not, because it's not about learning
that's part of it for sure. I mean, what you're seeing in creation is a revelation of God, and you can determine from that the kind of God that you're talking about. Favorite chapter and verses in Romans 1, where it talks about those who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. They know, they can plainly see the invisible attributes of God from creation. So it's not merely the things that we see, but it's the nature of the one that created it.
Right. So my question is, does the revelation, when we talk about general revelation, are we only referring to what we learn about God through these things in nature, right? Or are we also talking about the things we learn about nature in nature? That's something that has been confusing as I've read this, and I feel like I get different implicit responses from a lot of these books.
I think it's ultimately about God. I mean, when we learn about the nature of nature, that's telling us something about the one who created it.
Well, yeah, and so I feel that way too, but
no, I think that's correct. I mean, that's interesting. First of all, I use those terms synonymously, so general and natural revelation. So there may be others who don't, right? Maybe there's something I'm missing here. I do know that there's some debate about, the facts of history and which category, what category they fit into. And that goes beyond any particular thinker, as I understand it. So like Wolfhard Pannenberg, I think it comes up in debates regarding his theology, but you find it in others as well. This issue of where exactly to place that. But I'm not committed to one or the other for the purposes of this discussion. But I think that it's not wrong to say that general revelation would give us some knowledge of the nature of nature, as it were, itself. So if I perceive a tree, I mean, I infer there's a tree there, right? And I can then reason to different things concerning that tree, but I think I know some things about that tree just in an immediate sense, right? I think that's correct. But I think what's important to say, that Brian certainly wants to say, and I do too, and I think the Bible is that as we perceive the tree, we're also perceiving, in a sense, not in a sensuous sense, obviously, but we're perceiving, in a sense,
in a manner,
God. Because he's the one who created it, right? So and revealed it to reveal himself. But yeah, other things are revealed as well. So as we understand the world more, the created order, we certainly come to understand God more. We certainly come to understand ourselves more. As we understand ourselves more, we understand God more. We understand, as long as we understand those things rightly, those three are interconnected. And Calvin makes a big deal out of this at the beginning of his Institutes.
Right.
So.
Right. And why this is important, I guess, is because, in talking to people who have this other idea that, oh no, that's just about, God revealing things about himself through nature, then the thing is, if not all knowledge fits into these two categories of general revelation and special revelation, then you have a third category, which is either some other kind of revelation or it's not revelation at all, right? And so that's the reason why this feels so pertinent, is because is all knowledge from revelation, or are some things just inherently knowable apart from revelation? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, you may be making a distinction here between faith and reason, in a sense, at least analogously. And what I mean is, it's not as though every thought, that I have or something is a thought that I claim to have by some sort of direct revelation, the way that I, see the world around me or read God's holy word, right? So it's not like God is sitting there like dumping the thoughts into our minds in any other than a providential sense. Okay. But if you're a Calvinist in that way, it's not as though it's a constant special revelation or secret word or some such, right? What I'm saying is that some of our thoughts about things, whether that's about the world, whether that's about God, whether it's about ourselves or whatever, they're derivative, right? They're not immediate. They are mediate, right? And so this, I think, is important even when we talk about things like natural theology, which Fesco, I don't think he's clear enough regarding what he means by natural theology when he discusses that. This is why a book like Suttoth's book is so helpful, because he uses the tools of analytic philosophy to break down what he means by natural theology. And there are lots of different senses, and different historic writers would be using them in different ways too. Different historical figures were. But yeah, I there's a faith-seeking understanding tradition. So like there are things we can know about God through human reason. Now, is it ultimately unaided? No, I don't think so. Those things provide a basis whereby we might then reason to these different conclusions and whatnot. But we're not denying like the role of the senses, the role of reasoning, those sorts of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I will say there is one writer.
There's a lot of.
There's one writer who does flirt with sort of a third category, which he calls remnantal revelation. Remnantal revelation, and that would be Daniel Strange, and he is following J.H. Bavinck. I'd love to have him on here sometime, Brian, if we're able to ever get him on here. But I highly recommend him.
I'm familiar with Strange's work, but that's I don't consider remnantal revelation to be. I actually tried to. I wrote a paper interacting with some of his work and tried to categorize where remnantal revelation fit, and I can't remember what I decided, but I don't think it's contradictory to the idea that everything is either general or special.
Yeah, I don't think it's contradictory, but it's certainly special. We'll say that.
Well, yeah.
I can't say special, but you know what I mean.
Word.
it's basically special revelation that is preserved by means of general providence, ordinary providence.
Yeah, I don't think it's problematic in any sense, but it's a novelty of sorts, theologically speaking. But we'll move on.
Yeah, in some ways, to me, it seems obvious. It's like a necessary category. But okay, so natural theology. When you use the word natural theology, what do you mean by it, and what do you think Fesco means when he says natural theology?
It depends on what I'm talking about, right?
Okay.
But and I don't recall. I mean, I'd have to like find the page number and all that, so I'm not going to do that with Fesco right now. But natural theology, the way that Suttoth breaks it down, if I can remember this, he breaks it down into alpha and beta, but then he breaks it into further categories. So there's the immediate knowledge of God, and then there's a mediate, right? Not with the I. Mediate knowledge of God, and so there's natural theology in the sense of general revelation or natural revelation, and our knowledge of God by those means. And then there's natural theology in the sense of developing arguments based upon that type of knowledge, or even if there's a way to do that without it being based upon that knowledge. That's another sense of natural theology. I forget which he calls alpha and beta. I think alpha is the former and beta is the latter. That would make sense, but I don't remember. I think that book's like 2012 or maybe not 2009. Anyway, Ashgate, I believe. But you've got that distinction, but then within those you have other distinctions. So some of the distinctions within natural theology, when we think about it in terms of argumentation, you've got pre-dogmatic uses of natural theology. And so a pre-dogmatic function of natural theology is when we present an argument, like say a cosmological argument, as though it is the very basis of our belief, like whatever the remainder of those beliefs are. And so then we might also use that in an apologetic encounter then. So there's the apologetic function of natural theology. And so then there's also, though, natural theology in an argumentative sense that is derivative of or based upon the natural knowledge of God that's in the other type of natural theology, the other use of natural theology. And by the way, there are probably more helpful Latin terms for these, like the instantiated knowledge of God, or situated knowledge of God, or some such, and then the acquired knowledge of God, or scientific knowledge of God, these sorts of things. And so, Van Til did not reject all natural theology. There's certainly, Sutter does a good job in that book demonstrating that there really is not a reformed objection to natural theology. Now, Karl Barth, he often gets lumped in with all the reformed thinkers, which drives me absolutely up the wall, because that's not what Barth is. And the reason why, I think, is because of this whole thing. So what happens is beliefs that belong to Barth get, imputed to these other writers who are concerned about natural theology in some sense. I think that the main objection that would be leveled against natural theology by someone like Cornelius Van Til would come in at the point of either the apologetic use, although I think there are apologetic uses of natural theology. I've used natural theology and natural theological arguments in some of my debates, and I would argue I did so consistently with a strict Van Tilian presuppositionalism. But the pre-dogmatic use or function for natural theology, I think, is verboten, right? Like, we cannot do that. That's not the basis. The revelation of God is the basis. So I think those are the distinctions as I remember them. I find that to be helpful. I don't remember exactly how Fesco puts it, but he does not break it down on that sort of level.
Yeah, that's kind of the concern that I had, is that he did not, but also Van Til didn't exactly either, break it down. So here you have, like, one person conflating for his purposes, another critiquing that conflation by not acknowledging that it is kind of a conflation. You know what I mean? It seems like Van Til, when he talks about natural theology, is only talking about pre-dogmatic natural theology. And then Fesco is primarily concerned with post-dogmatic natural theology, and then taking everything Van Til says about natural theology as the latter rather than the former. It just seems like they're talking past each other. Not that Van Til is involved in a two-way dialogue now, but
Yeah, I don't recall whether or not Fesco does that or not. So I'm going to let you be the bad guy and assign that to him, whereas I'm not going to, because I'm not going to hunt for it right this moment on the podcast. But I will, and it's been a while since I've read this, but I will concede your point, I think, about Van Til, that he wasn't always necessarily the clearest. He's certainly not using the analytical tools that, oh my goodness, I shouldn't have used that phrase. He certainly was not using analytic theology and philosophy the way that Sutter does in that book. So yes, I'll concede that for sure. Although I don't think that's necessarily a criticism of Van Til. It's just that his later thinkers kind of in that stream have developed it more. But I'm interested what the purist thinks about that. The purist in the room here.
Is that me? I was going to say it would make sense. I haven't. I don't recall reading a lot about Van Til talking about natural theology, but it would make sense that if he were criticizing it, it would be from a pre-dogmatic perspective. So if that's the kind of thing he's doing when he's talking about it, I would agree it would be that category of natural theology. I would also say there were, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but there are some things that I noticed. This is something that Van Tilians complain about all the time, and that is, no, you're misrepresenting Van Til, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is, and he's just not that clear a lot of times. In other words, you have to read Van Til for quite a while to begin to understand when he's talking, what he's saying, and how he's thinking. This is my perspective and my experience. And then it's almost like, well, what do you mean? That's not what he means at all. So for me, when I saw Fesco talking about criticizing Van Til for and quoting Van Til about evidential apologetics and saying that Van Til doesn't believe in using evidences, and then I saw the same thing when in regard to knowledge. Can the unbeliever know things? And it's like you completely miss the in practice, in principle distinction that's actually called out by Van Til using those words, not often, but that's one of the major underpinnings of presuppositionalism is that distinction. And there's all sorts of things we can do in practice because we live in God's world. Christianity is true, but in principle, the unbelievers being inconsistent with their principles because those principles could not account.
Yeah, and that's another issue where it felt like there was a conflation going on. Van Til would talk about, he'd use this adverb truly, right? To truly
know. Yeah.
And I feel like people who criticize him, I don't know if they maybe have a better idea of what he means than I do, but they certainly have a different idea of what he means than I do. And that really is.
So what do you think he means by that, by truly?
Sure, I'll give an answer, but what I was going to say is that a lot of times it's hard for me to take these criticisms seriously because maybe they are criticizing Van Til. And if they are, I'd really want to know that, but they're certainly not criticizing any of my beliefs, right? And so what I take him to mean by truly, and it's been a long time since I've read a lot of his works, but to truly know something is to know it in relation to God without having that major suppression of of the knowledge of God. So to truly know it is to know it in relation to God. So you can know it otherwise, but you cannot truly know it without knowing it in relation to God. Does that sound accurate?
I would agree with that. And I would also add, again, this would be my perception, but I think it goes back to what Chris and I have talked about before, thin and thick reasoning. To truly know something is to be able to count for it all the way down to, the foundations. There's in a sense, I'm going to get in trouble for this. In a sense, unbelievers don't know things. At least they don't know them from the perspective of, they don't know them truly, but they don't know them from the perspective of having drilled all the way down to a foundation and then being consistent with that foundation. That's the criticism. That's what we do when we do an internal critique, is showing here's this given that you've given me, and it's not consistent if we drive all the way down through to the most basic beliefs that you have. If their basic beliefs were true, in principle, they wouldn't be able to know things. In fact, I had a couple, let's see if I can find it, slides here. Let me pull this up. So there's an important distinction between knowing in practice and knowing in principle. Unbelievers certainly know things in practice, but they could not in principle know anything at all if their worldview were true. What they do know in practice, they know just because the Christian worldview is true. And so it's the idea of, if Christianity were true then, and if your worldview were true then, taking those principles, those worldviews, and seeing what the results would be based on them.
So I'm amazed right now by two things. One is you had a typo in that quote, and so it said worldview instead of worldview.
I don't know what you're talking about.
That's forever going to drive me crazy. I know you noticed it because, yeah. And the other thing is I can hardly believe that we've been going for 43 minutes already. I feel like we've been going for 4 minutes. But I did find some quotes here from Fesco using that term, natural theology in particular, that might be helpful to bring out, just to show that actually there's a lot of commonality here as well. So when Fesco diverges from Van Tilian thought, he's either, I think, doing it in the first instance through a misunderstanding of Van Til, perhaps, like we've already mentioned, or he's diverging from Van Til in the sense that he uses this other terminology like common notions and that sort of thing, and takes it in a different way, because Van Til does discuss common notions, by the way, and does affirm them. So that's one of the things I want to say here, and I think this is probably one of the reasons why I found portions of this book significantly confusing, because as Fesco's laying the groundwork, I see him also, there's kind of this thread through the book that he's critiquing Van Til, and I'm thinking, well, this is not really a criticism of Van Til. So on page 2, he writes this: Reformed theologians acknowledged the reality and the utility of natural revelation, namely the knowledge of God in creation. So that's the natural theology, the immediate that I mentioned earlier, as well as a limited and carefully defined natural theology. So there he's using natural revelation in the sense that some people use natural theology, which I think is actually unhelpful, and I think he's correct. So natural revelation versus natural theology, a carefully defined natural theology, though. And so here's what he says. That is, they acknowledged that there were certain truths available to the powers of natural reason, which is what I said earlier, right? We have this history of faith seeking understanding. And so we can know things about God through human reasoning. Mm-hmm. We can. We're not denying that. Just as one can exegete the book of Scripture, so too can one exegete the book of nature and make true claims about God.
Sure.
I agree with all of this. But the Reformed theologians were clear. This knowledge is not saving, but is complementary to supernatural revelation or Scripture. The book of Scripture gives knowledge of Christ and salvation, and thus takes interpretive priority in the exegesis of the book of nature. Now, I would say that Scripture does not only give knowledge of Christ and salvation. I think it touches on an entire worldview, as it were, which is probably another topic we can get into. But everything said there, Van Tillian would actually heartily affirm, so far as I know, and I certainly would heartily affirm that. He uses this term again on page 9, I believe it is. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Despite contemporary aversions to natural theology, well, I'd want to know what he's referencing there. If he's talking about Van Tillian's running around the internet, he's probably right. If he's talking about Clarkians or something, I mean, we're not in that camp, right? But
right.
Despite contemporary aversions to natural theology, historic Reformed theology made regular and frequent use of the book of nature, okay? And the present volume aims to recover it for apologetics. So the question there is merely one of how does he propose in that final chapter that we make use of the book of nature? That's it. That's where the debate would rest, right? Because Greg Bahnsen himself in his debate with Gordon Stein goes through and lists all these natural evidences of the existence of God, if you recall. And then the last time he uses natural theology is on page 135. He quotes from Turretin, just talking about divinely implanted common notions, which again, Van Til affirms this concept of common notions, but he wants to talk about common notions for all, and he wants to talk about common notions for unbelievers. And he wants to kind of tinker with the concept a little bit, even though, again, as far as I know, Van Tillians would affirm things like even up to natural law. We would affirm natural law in some sense. I think that the Apostle Paul uses that in Romans 1, for example. And the idea of common notions, the light of nature in man, the natural knowledge of God. Yeah, I mean, that goes right with the Romans 1 apologetic, right?
Right. So, Conley, what are your, I don't know if you've thought about it in this way, but what are your, stumbling blocks when it comes to using Presupp? You said that you had gone through and you had used it in the past, but you weren't necessarily.
No, I would still, if we're talking about in practice, sure. Yeah. I mean, I believe that it's the only biblical apologetic.
Well, we're done. I mean, there you go.
Yeah. No, the question, he gets to keep his beard.
Intervention was a success.
He doesn't have to shave after the episode.
The question is not the question is not what I affirm in practice. It's, as I'm teaching as a pastor, do I feel comfortable putting my name behind this other name, knowing how many people, have pointed out problems, quote unquote problems that I don't understand. And there's a lot of other things we haven't got to, and I hope we still have time for some of them. But I don't know about the whole boogeyman of Kant. I don't know if Kantian idealism is how bad that is and how much it influenced Van Til. And I feel like I should know these things before, as a pastor am telling other people what they should believe, there's intelligence involved here.
I think you can I think there's a way to know enough to be able to respond like on the spot. Like you can talk about how much Van Til criticized idealism and Kant in particular. So it's not, I think one of the things Fesco said was, I feel that he imports the concepts, not just the methodology, but actually some of the concepts from Kant. And I don't think we would agree with that. I think he does use a methodology that is similar, but there are even differences in the methodology. He certainly doesn't start in the same place that Kant does. So I think there are ways that you can, ask these questions and get answers to be able to address them initially. And if somebody continues to push, then you can say, well, let me get back to you. If you're looking for more detail, I can either point you in the direction of something, or let me go researching and come back. But yeah.
Nor does Van Til think that the Christian apologetic began with Immanuel Kant, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
The claim I hear over and over again. If you read Van Til, Christianity and Idealism is a book he wrote. And, all of these are ripoffs of Christianity and liberalism, right? So there's Christianity and idealism, Christianity and Barthianism, and these sorts of things. He's saying these are not Christian ways of thinking. And so he does not believe idealism is a Christian way of thinking. He wrote his dissertation against idealism. He explicitly criticizes Kant. And yet I still have people coming to me saying things who have not read as much Van Til as me, to be quite frank. I'm not saying that about Fesco, but personal acquaintances, and they will say to me, but he still uses Kant without really knowing it. And I'm thinking, like, really? I'm not sure that you know Kant as well as Van Til knew him, considering he wrote his doctoral dissertation in philosophy on it at, a significant school.
Princeton, yeah.
But anyway, in Christianity and Idealism, Van Til, I will grant that he probably he's not as careful with his words as he should be, but what he's getting at is that Kant has given us the ultimate illustration, as it were, of the would-be autonomous thinker, right? So Kant's trying to fix all of these problems by coming up with this, analytic, synthetic mixture, all these sorts of things, and comes up with these ideas to try to resolve the problems that the skeptics have thrown at him, namely David Hume. And he does so by positing a so-called transcendental argument or transcendental method of argumentation that revolves around the individual thinker. And it gets him into an egocentric predicament. And there are clearly good criticisms of Kant, even within secular philosophy, along those lines. But I would add also that it's actually debated within the scholarship on transcendental arguments as to whether or not Kant actually even uses a transcendental argument,
or if he was the first, for that matter.
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Yeah, and I would say he was certainly not the first.
No. So. Like many things, his name is on it, but he wasn't the first.
Is it more explicit? Absolutely. It's just like Van Til. I mean, if Van Tilians are claiming that their method is biblical, and I'm not talking about whether or not that claim is true.
Right.
If Van Tilians are claiming that their method is biblical, they don't believe that Immanuel Kant or even Cornelius Van Til was the true father of their method. I mean, I know he is the father of modern presuppositionalism, but that just means he made it more explicit.
Yeah, right. It would have really helped me in this book if he had defined some of these terms and not just assumed I knew what they meant. So, would you be able to define Kantian idealism or realism? Because he's, pitting these things against each other, and I don't have a firm grasp on definitions.
I'm not sure to what extent. Brian, are you any help on this?
Boy, if you get me going, get me started. It's not my strong suit for sure.
Maybe I can ask a different question. There's so many questions.
Isn't idealism that we in our mind are determining what's real, and realism is there's an external world that's out there that's real, and we're trying to learn about it.
Right, but then what is? So that's what idealism is. But then what's Kantian idealism? And isn't there a sense in which that's true? Which there is a gap between creature, and God, bridges that gap in a way, because our for our senses to process things into knowledge. I mean, is isn't there some kind of divine aid necessary for that? So isn't that idealism in a sense?
Yeah, I mean there are like
There's
Christian
overlaps.
varieties of
Yeah.
idealist thinking, right? So that you do have not so much a denial of material reality as you do just a undefinable or indefinable thing known as matter, right? And so you've got God and then his idea. We're all, part of that, as it were. I think this eventually runs into problems along the lines of occasionalism and the problem of evil. So which I think you're getting at. But what I was looking for is how Fesco describes this, as far as Kantian idealism. But again, in the confines of this podcast, under the gun here, looking it up real quick by way of the see German idealism, Kantian idealism. Now I got to go to a completely different part in the back here, 182.
Okay, one other question that's, I guess, unrelated, but why do critics of Van Til seem to think Van Tilians have an essential problem with classical theism?
I think that's just simply I think that is a simple misunderstanding driven by two things. One is the terminology, so like classical apologetics and classical theism, and the other is politics related to recent issues that I'm not going to go into in any great depth because I don't want to get myself in any more trouble.
I've wondered if it's some kind of tribalism where, there's like one Van Tilian kind of off the rails and some others have followed him, and now the non-Van Tilians, I don't know. Is it something like that?
We're allowed to say things as Baptists, I think, that Presbyterians can't say. It's
oh dear.
There's not this overarching sense of authority or whatever over us in a sense. Other than Jesus, there's not an overarching sense of authority.
Although people keep telling me Van Til is my hero. I heard that again today.
Well, I'm talking about as far as a Presbyterian and Presbyterian politics and that sort of thing.
Okay.
As Duyaverid may claim to be a descendant of Calvin, this is on page 183, his Kantian idealism is worlds apart from Calvin's theological system. Again, man, I tell you, it's been, I know what idealism is, but it's been so long since I've read this book that I would have to go back, and I don't want to do him wrong. What I'm simply saying is, and he admits this in, I think in the chapter on transcendental argument, that Van Til does use idealist type language, right? Like the absolute and all these sorts of
universals
things.
And
I don't think that in fact, I know that Van Til's understanding of worldview is not the Hegelian thesis and all of this sort of stuff that Fesco presents in his book. In fact, Van Til, and I don't have the quotes available, but he explicitly denies that type of system where you can pick one point and then deduce everything else from it. That's not what he believes.
No.
So, I think in the same sense that the Apostle John in John 1 uses the Logos terminology, so also Van Til is using the lingo of idealism. The same thing, with the author of Hebrews, which I don't, it doesn't matter who you think that is, as long as you agree with me, it's Apollos. But the author of Hebrews, right, uses this language as well. In the early Christian thinkers with Augustine, we had an episode recently on Christian Platonism, but that gets under my skin. But anyway, Augustine, he's clearly using some of these like terms and even maybe the categories a bit with Platonic thought and that sort of thing. We should expect that. Like we as Christians now in this century in America, in the United States of America, are using a lot of categories of pragmatism, a lot of the language of pragmatism and these sorts of things. Who knows how many times we've said during this podcast, I don't know whether or not that works or that does work or something to that effect. Right. And Fesco does a good job of going all the way down in on that though, and saying, okay, Van Til and Van Tilians are claiming mere formal agreement, but he does ask, what is formal agreement though? Like there has to be some sort of substantive agreement, even on a formal level, or we don't get anywhere. And I would actually say, yeah, you're actually right. I just don't think it undermines Van Tillianism. And I don't think that it means that Van Til is an idealist at all. In fact, and I'm going to make this claim, I've been thinking about this for so long, I want to put it into a tweet or something, but Van Til is closer to Acts 17 in this than are the classical apologists who think that presuppositionalists don't know how to deal with Acts 17. Because Van Til is using, hey, I noticed this statue to an unknown God. That's exactly what Van Til is doing when he uses that explicit language of idealism, or idealist thought, rather. To the classical theism thing again, there is a published work that's coming out with regard to that question as well, Lord willing, in the future. So I'm excited about that and looking forward to that. But yeah, I think some of our brothers within presuppositional land or presuppositional world, they are they don't. So there's a problem when we take a philosophical grid and import it to Scripture or impose it upon Scripture. And I do think there are some concerns at some level with that, with traditional classical theism. And then on the other hand, like, we don't want to be heretics. We don't want to affirm, process theology and these sorts of things, which it's very, very easy to get down that road once you start talking about things like causality and all that, which I do have to know a little bit about. But I think that has conflated some issues in people's minds to where they think that if you're Van Tillian, you're not a classical theist or can't be in any sense. And that's just simply wrong. So yeah. All
right. Well, it's good to hear someone say that. But
yeah, I don't know why that would follow. Like I'm welcome to, like, I'm open to hearing the argument, but I don't know why. I don't know
either. That's the thing. It's like there's these assertions that there are all these connections that I just haven't seen, and I'm trying to figure out if they really exist or what. Yeah. How much time do we have? Do we have to close here? Do we have time for more questions? Or
it's still like 8 a.m. over there.
Yeah,
right?
we've got time. I wanna pop up while we're pausing here. Hopefully there's no typos in this. This is from I think this is from Anderson's. Oh yeah, so this was a quote where he was talking about.
Man, that's a paraphrase of Van Til if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, talking about what do you have to know in order to know anything at all, and so let me just read it. Thus, while the Bible doesn't say everything there is to say about any particular thing, it does have something to say about everything, and what it has to say is absolutely authoritative because it's the word of Christ. So it's not like Scripture is a science textbook, right? Or it's not giving us specifics. In fact, I'll probably get in trouble for this, but there's a lot of things that Scripture doesn't talk about. Certainly not directly. There are things that are precepts in Scripture that we have to keep in mind as we're attempting to learn about things. So, what we learn should not be in contradiction to Scripture, but there are some things that Scripture is silent about. But the basic things about how we know things and what our relationship is with God and what our purpose is here, and even how we learn, all of those things are addressed in Scripture, not as they would be addressed in a philosophy textbook, but certainly they're there.
Yeah. On page 216, Fesco writes, the Scriptures undoubtedly present truth claims that intersect with a host of general knowledge claims. The Bible's not a science textbook, which is what you just said, but it does teach that God immediately created Adam. Some scientists are entertaining the idea that the universe did not begin with the Big Bang, but has always existed, that the universe is in some sense eternal. The Bible, however, claims that God created the universe out of nothing. By the way, there are a number of natural theological arguments that would actually try to prove that the universe always has existed. But anyway, so the Bible does provide, he references Hebrews 11:3 there. So the Bible does provide Christians with important facts about the world, but as important as these facts are, the Bible does not provide comprehensive knowledge. But I mean, that makes me want to ask, well, who is this about? I mean, this is a good basic thing to set forth,
right?
But is there an audience here? Like, who is it that believes this?
Right.
That's like I said before. Yeah, like say something I don't agree with. Do you understand his contentions about coherence theory versus correspondence theory?
I mean, yes and no. Go ahead, Brian.
He thinks Van Tillians are strict coherentists. Is my understanding. As long as there's a way that you can demonstrate internal consistency and coherence within your worldview, then you're good to go. And we don't care about whether it actually corresponds to the reality outside of our minds. Well, Van Til is explicitly clear that we don't use either of those terms, but we use both of them. We use them in a different manner. That's, I think, pretty sure that's in his Survey of Christian Epistemology where he talks about that. So it's not like he hasn't addressed it. Now, Fesco may be saying, in practice, there are some Van Tillians who do this. And yeah, there are. But that's not a criticism of the system or the person. That's a criticism of those who are not following, the system. Just like it would be with any system you're following.
So help me
understand.
Go ahead. Sorry. Help me understand that, because part of me feels like that kind of is the essence of tag, to say that all things are related to God in such a way that it would be impossible to have internal consistency in any other system, any other worldview.
So here's a worldview. Or do you want to do this, Brian?
No, you do it. It's Chris's. What is it? The succinct worldview prime, or go ahead.
Yeah,
there's only one proposition, right?
I stole this right from Michael Butler. Yeah, okay. I mean, consider worldview P, the only content of which is P. Okay, so the content of worldview P is P. Now, what is incoherent with that? I mean, there is no logical inconsistency in that worldview. I don't know how you would even begin to demonstrate such.
It doesn't account for anything, but yeah, it's internally
and that's the problem. I mean, P does not even contain within itself the tools with which you might state P. Right. So that's the Van Tillian claim. I mean, there's a reason that Van Til says you can't predicate. He's not saying that they're logically impossible per se, although we think they are. But he's saying they can't even predicate. Like you can't utter anything, right? Which actually Van Til's brighter there than people give him credit for, because there's been more work done on this in terms of self-refutation. A lot of us, in a colloquial sense, in a layperson's approach to this, will see the negative transcendental critique as consisting of self-refutation. But actually, we're talking about something deeper than that. We're talking about self-defeat. We're talking about an inability to give utterance to a position, which is actually more philosophically precise, and yet Van Til nails it even from a continental type approach.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess whenever I think of internal consistency, because I had those same objections, initially, coming up with very small examples that are internally consistent. Recognizing that when the Choosing Hats crowd basically would say internally consistent, they meant including the fact that this argument is being made. Right. So that makes sense to me. So then what should I, if Fesco knocks on my door and says, you believe coherence theory, or I don't know, whatever he would say, based on what he's written in this book.
I mean, the one thing is where Van Til talks about his definition, or the definition that we should use of objective, and that is it corresponds to God's mind. Okay, so it's not, and that's a very limited example, but it still, I think, meets the criteria. It's not simply internally consistent. I mean, the other thing we spent a whole episode talking about this. It's not just inconsistency; it's arbitrariness.
Right.
Those two things. You want to say something? Go ahead.
Sorry. So is the problem that he's pointing out that he thinks we would deny correspondence theory or not care about it, or is the problem that he's pointing out that coherence theory is wrong, right? Because
no, Fesco is. I don't know whether or not he's saying that coherence theory is wrong per se. except as I think it relates back to idealism.
Okay.
But again, some of these things, and I mentioned this earlier, right, with the is-ought and the descriptive and prescriptive, and going through a history of these things and associations doesn't show that one or another person is right or wrong. So it seems as though it's like idealism is this thing that poisons everything in a way, I think, if I'm reading them properly. And so insofar as coherence is associated with idealism, it's a problem. It's not necessarily a problem, but I do think he wants to say what you just mentioned, which is that we're not getting to correspondence, and that's a problem. Because this does lock us into a postmodern type understanding of the world, which is not at all what we want to say as Van Tillians.
No.
But again, this has become very popular in circles that criticize Van Tillianism now, to where they think we're cut off from the objective realm or something. That's not what we're saying. I want to, I mean, I'm talking a lot, but he does address this on page 149.
Yeah.
What's that?
Nothing.
And this is the part, Brian, that you've given a little study to. So on page 149, though, here's what he writes. And he considers this an issue regarding the tag. And I don't mean to nitpick, but anyway, I've never seen anyone say the tag. That's actually technically better. That's correct, because it's the transcendental argument for God. But anyway, a second issue regarding the tag is that some of its proponents use one theory of truth to excess. So that's his objection, that the coherence theory is used to excess.
Right.
In terms of the tag, the apologist makes the claim, again, this is page 149, the apologist makes the claim that the presupposition of the existence of the triune God of the Bible best explains all reality. Well, actually, it's that only he explains all reality.
Right.
Whether it's scientific experimentation, ethics, aesthetics, politics, philosophy, or anything else. All right. Mm-hmm. Then he says this. This methodology rests on the coherence theory of truth. No, it doesn't. In fact, all of those things he just mentioned have facts about them, right?
They correspond. Right.
There's correspondence theory involved in every one of those he mentioned. So this is an interesting claim to me. He goes on, a classic definition of the coherence theory of truth, which, by the way, he may be conflating a coherence theory of epistemology with the coherence theory of truth here. But anyway, runs thus. Quote, he quotes from Harold H. Joachim. I'm supposed to know how to pronounce this. Joachim. I've read him, but I don't remember how to pronounce it. Truth in its essential nature is that systematic coherence which is the character of a significant whole. A similar definition appears in more recent coherence theories associated, here he goes, with British idealism. And this is what I mentioned a moment ago. It's like this idealism comes through and poisons everything. So this coherence theory is a problem insofar as it corresponds to idealism. He quotes, a belief is true if and only if it's part of a coherent system of beliefs. Well, we're not saying if and only if.
Not the only if, no.
Yeah. Much of Van Til's interaction, this is the end quote, that was from Glantzberg. Much of Van Til's interaction engagement with idealism was through its British 20th century versions. And this is why I don't feel confident commenting on what Fesco says about idealism, because he does talk about different varieties, such as that presented in F.H. Bradley's Appearance and Reality. Van Til was first exposed to Bradley during his undergraduate education at Calvin College and continued to interact with him throughout his career. Here's what he says. The coherence theory of truth certainly fits within Van Til's apologetic and theological system. Van Til argues that the claims of Christianity best explain all reality. Well, no, he claims that it's the only one that explains all reality. But also, notice what's been said here. Just because the coherence theory of truth fits with Van Til's approach doesn't mean that he is thereby exclusively a coherentist, right? It's just saying that we have that accessible to us as Van Tillians, but Fesco doesn't make that more modest and appropriate claim. He jumps into saying, oh, so they're coherentists, or at least we use this to excess. But and those are not the same claims either, by the way. But I find that problematic. But I have something that's even more problematic related to that. But I'll let you guys talk for a minute.
I don't think I have anything else about that. But
okay.
Except for that, there's got to be some way of stating this. Well, first of all, Brian, a second ago, you said not the only if part, but I think you mean the if part, right? Something isn't true just because it's coherent, but it's true only if it is coherent, right?
Well, so, what I was trying to say was it's a necessary precondition, but not or a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one.
Right.
In other words, it's got to be coherent, but in addition to that, it's got to correspond.
Right. But there is a sense in which if something is coherent, given enough, gosh, I don't know all the philosophical terminology, but given enough pieces, if it is all coherent, that does mean that it is necessarily true, right? Like when we're talking about making the argument itself, right? Predication, right? If that is included as one of the pieces, and then everything else coheres with that, doesn't that necessarily mean that the worldview is true? And see, I've lacked the language to express my question.
No, I think I know what you're saying. But
didn't I present a counter example though?
No, well, not one that included, like you said, predication, right? Like that was not part of the
right, but that was to demonstrate that merely positing a coherent worldview does not mean that one has a worldview that's sufficient to account for human intelligibility. I mean, if you want to stretch the meaning of coherence to cover something in a colloquial sense, like, hey, this has got to be able to account for everything, and so on and so forth, then sure. But that's broader than what philosophers mean when they're talking about coherence versus correspondence, I believe. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but then there's something missing in my mind, though, because this is the essence of tag, right? It's to show that every other worldview is necessarily incoherent given, whatever this thing that we're presupposing is, right? Given, that logic exists, or given that, things are beautiful, or given that there's good and bad.
Yeah, but I think you're, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful sense at all, I think you're equivocating on what's meant by coherence here. So okay. I'm thinking in fairly strictly logical categories, or in terms of a coherence theory of truth or epistemology, versus I think that you're taking, what you just said there, isn't this the point of tag, to demonstrate that these other worldviews lack coherence? Well, no, I would say no, it's not. Sure, they might or do. Worldview P doesn't lack coherence in a logical sense, but worldview P cannot account for human intelligibility. It can't even say anything of itself. It can't even state itself, right? Or an adherent to worldview P can't do anything. And so that person then, it's a self-stultifying type view. That person can't even utter the truth of his or her own worldview. And so certainly there's no reason to worry about worldview P as a competitor to Christianity when that person can't even utter a word in affirmation or denial of God without presupposing God. That's the same thing we want to say of any worldview. So we're looking not merely for the worldview criterion of coherence in a strictly logical truth or epistemological sense, but rather we're looking at the criteria, is that the plural, of coherence, correspondence, livability. Is that the right word, Brian?
Does it work?
Like no. What's that?
Does it work?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sure.
What does it get you? Yeah. I think maybe Conley, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but there certainly are a lot of presuppers that use tag that concentrate on showing inconsistency or lack of coherence, right?
So if I could reframe it, though, my concern isn't about the first step of the of tag, right? It's about the second step, where you show that the Christian worldview is coherent, right? And that and that it's not just coherent, but coherent with this. And I don't even know if that's a phrase I'm allowed to use, when we're using the word coherence in a strictly philosophical.
No, I understood you there to be differentiating. So yeah.
But aren't we saying that the fact that that the Christian worldview is consistent with this thing that we both have as this like common presupposition, right? Morality, like good and bad. Isn't that the essence of tag, is to say that because it is coherent, that it is true when all things are
not only because it's coherent,
I would
but
not
because
say that.
but, I mean, because again, Chris's example of worldview P is consistent, but it does not account for.
Right. Well, that's so there's a way that I could include the word account for with coherence somehow. See, I'm using the word coherence to mean account for, and that's like part of the problem.
Right. I think that's what Chris was saying. The way you're using the word perhaps is
okay. But why is coherence not like a good term to mean account for? If I've included
because of the way Fesco uses it, that's why. Okay. Because he appears to be using it in its more strict philosophical sense. Yeah. Even though I note, and I'd have to go back and study again to see, but it looks like he may be confusing or conflating coherence theory of truth with coherence epistemology. That's a little bit nitpicky, but still, it's something that philosophers care about. But yeah, so no, I mean, again, I'll grant what you're saying there. If we're using coherence in a colloquial sense,
right?
But I'm pointing out that there is a philosophical sense wherein coherence is distinct from correspondence, is distinct from a pragmatic view of truth, and so on and so forth.
If by coherent you mean it makes sense or makes sense of.
No, I mean is logically consistent. That's what I mean by coherence, right? Where I'm including what would you call P in
But that was not respectfully, that was not what you meant a moment ago when you mentioned coherence, because you said, it includes these other things too, right? I mean, you even distinguished. We'll have to go back and look at what you said, but you actually used coherence the first time in a philosophical sense. Then you use coherence again in a broader sense. And so I'll give you an analogy, and maybe this will be helpful, and maybe it'll confuse everybody even more. Sometimes you'll hear presuppositionalists talk about, well, for example, justifying logic. I'm not asking someone to justify logic. I'm not even sure what that means. Yeah. But I am asking for an account of logic. Now, when I talk about account, that's a more colloquial term. That is, though, incorporating all sorts of different things. What is the nature of logic? Is it conventional? Is it natural? Is it Platonic? What is the nature of reality? How do those two mesh? How do we know these things? How are they necessary? The laws of logic necessary? What are the laws of logic? I'm asking a whole slew of questions there. When I ask for someone to account for it, we're talking about worldviews in conflict, not the particular issue of logic, and not merely a narrower understanding of something like justification, where we're talking about, justifying a belief for a knowledge claim. Does that make sense analogously, or does that may be?
It does, helpful, but my question is slightly different, so it's kind of hard to like see how your answer is putting into it. If I can just say some stupid things for several sentences, and then
we say stupid things on here all the time.
All right,
we have like 200 subscribers, so go for it.
So, let me say a bunch of stupid things and then correct me afterward. Okay, so P in the minimal world, or the minimal system that you described earlier, that P would be a predicate, right?
P is simply the claim of the worldview, whether it's a predicate or a subject. I don't even think you can make sense of whether it's a subject or a predicate.
You're saying it's a proposition, though, isn't that why?
It is a proposition.
Yeah, I guess mathematically, you would often use the word predicate, so that's why I was going for that. But
I got you. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out which vocabulary I should be using.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Let's call it a proposition. Okay, so let's say I have a bunch of propositions. As long as I include one of these other propositions, right, like that human intelligibility, right, or morality, as long as I've included one of those propositions as a proposition that everything else must be consistent with, then wouldn't it make sense to say that saying that you have to account for this thing is the same thing as saying that you have to have a coherent system that includes this thing. What is the difference in how this vocabulary works that I'm missing?
No, I think you're perfectly correct in what you just said. I just think that is the less formal use of the word coherent in this context, because a coherence theory of truth or a coherence theory of knowledge, those are very specific things, philosophically speaking, that pertain to internal consistency, usually logically construed within a system, versus something like a sense of fittingness, or the ability to know things, the ability to make things intelligible, the ability to live out particular claims, whatever that means. I mean, that's very difficult to construe in a logical sense, right?
So you're just saying because of the difficulty of declaring those things as propositions, that's why.
Yeah, I mean, if you're like a mathematic thinker and we want to go through and try to articulate an entire worldview in terms of like propositions and axioms and things like that, that's one thing. That I think that would take us more into rationalistic type waters or Clarkianism than a Van Tillian approach. I mean, because and another thing that plays into this, which we don't want to get into and don't have time to, but it is Van Til's whole idea of analogy, right? So, I mean, all of this is analogous. It's not like our knowledge and God's knowledge is exactly the same.
Right.
And with that, then, is this idea of paradox, theological paradox, or as James Anderson puts it, macrus, right? Merely apparent contradictions resulting from unarticulated equivocation. And so that pertains to the big three, we think, like the Trinity or the hypostatic union or free will and human responsibility, the sovereignty of God, however you want to flesh that out. Someone like Paul Manata actually rejects that third one, last I checked, actually being a true theological paradox. He thinks it can be logically resolved, which, okay. Herman Bavinck believes that wherever the infinite touches the finite, this sort of thing, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, there is some sense of mystery, which makes sense to me. And so the reason I pull these out is because it's very, very difficult to articulate or even to defend those in strictly logical categories. I'm not positing contradictions in the Christian worldview because there are none. So in that sense, yes, it's coherent. But, and I think Fesco would want to say that too, or anyone would want to say there are no contradictions. Any Christian would want to say there are no contradictions in the Christian worldview. I don't know. There's some people actually who would affirm contradictions, but that takes us down like Soren Kierkegaard route and all that. But no, as far as our audience and who we're talking to right now, right? We would say, no, it's coherent, logically coherent, all that. But with that, can it be lived out? You know, does it provide a basis for intelligibility? Does it make our experience intelligible? Can you
Is
predicate?
there any explanatory power to it?
Yeah, explanatory power. All of these things go into it, not merely the logical consistency. Right. Because again, if we focus purely on logical consistency and elevate, say, the law of non-contradiction as though it were the absolute, as though it is our God of our system, that's not going to work when it comes, and there's that word, but it's not going to work when it comes to things like, claims about the Trinity or about the hypostatic union. And for why that's the case, see Anderson's book on that, right? What is that called? Is it Theological Paradox? I think is the name of it.
Yeah.
Paradox in Christian Theology.
I've read Boston's book on paradox.
Hey, so we're at 90 minutes now. We're going strong. We're doing good, but I think we need to try to wrap it up just because we want to keep our viewers in mind.
Okay. Yeah.
It's much better to come along with another episode, I think, and pick things up. So,
go ahead.
I was going to say, let's go around and give everybody a chance to kind of wrap, like Conley, if you want to wrap some things up, and then Chris.
Yeah. So there's one other thing that Fesco does at the end of that long portion I was reading a moment ago. But Brian, you might want to address that, and that's Greg Bonson's article on the impropriety of arguing
evidentially arguing for the resurrection. That was exactly the section that I was referring to earlier.
Yeah. So either you can pick that up now, or because I'm about to come back and kind of close that loop on what I was talking about with the coherence theory a moment ago.
Well, you've got the book in front of you, right? So I would say go ahead and read it. It's, if I remember right.
Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah.
So
Fesco says something and then he quotes Van Til or.
Yeah. So on page 150, now remember what we've said in 149 and 150, my objections to Fesco's understanding of the coherence theory and whether or not Van Tilians are relegated to that or use it too excessively, whatever that means.
Is this in chapter 5 or chapter 6 that you're in, by the way?
This is Transcendental Arguments, which would be chapter 6.
6, right. Because I have the Kindle version here, but there's no page numbers.
Gotcha. So at the bottom of page 150, after he's talked about coherence, he shifts and he says, note that the effectiveness of the tag rests upon the perceived incoherence of the contested worldviews. But something Bonson neither shows nor demonstrates is the necessity to employ evidence in conjunction with the tag. At certain points, Bonson also gives the impression that the use of evidence is illegitimate, as we see in the title of one of his essays, quote, the impropriety of evidentially arguing for the resurrection, end quote. Bonson, for example, writes, and then he quotes from Bonson in that article, Scripture itself should be enough to dissuade a person from depending upon evidential arguments for Christ's resurrection.
And that's, let me stop you right there.
Yeah, I can stop there.
Evidential arguments, not the use of evidences, but an evidential approach to argumentation. That's the whole point of this essay that he wrote, after all. So it's not that Bonson, in fact, Bonson talks on multiple occasions about, this particular criticism of presuppositionalism. In fact, I think is it in the Stein debate where he talks about, reorienting some of the standard arguments, apologetic arguments within the framework of presuppositionalism.
I think that's in the Sproul debate, maybe.
Is it? Okay. Yeah.
He actually does it in the reader, in the readings and analysis.
He gives an example.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. But there's also this story floating around, which I have confirmed with Gary Habermas, that Bonson sat there and listened to Dr. Gary Habermas give the minimalist facts approach to the historical arguments for the resurrection of Christ, and he comes up to him and it's like, what did you think about that? Or they were having dinner, so I forget all the details. But anyway, Bonson basically said, no, that was good. It was presuppositional. So he certainly didn't deny the place of the use of evidences, or that they're very persuasive to people who already believe, and that sort of thing. But yeah, there's a distinction to be made between evidentialism and evidences. There I go talking again. I want to close out what I was going to say about coherence, and then I'm going to be quiet.
Go ahead. All right,
although I don't know if we're doing questions tonight or not, but
no.
Oh no, that's too bad. Okay. So, we've been associated with the coherence theory of truth, or epistemology. The idea is, we're trying to demonstrate that all other worldviews are incoherent, right? And Conley got hung up. You got hung up on this, right? And so we talked about this at length. Well, isn't that the claim of tag, to demonstrate that they're incoherent and that sort of thing? Now, buckle up, because I don't understand what's about to happen. On page 156, here's what Fesco writes. But what if the person has not a coherent worldview, but only an eclectic postmodern assortment of beliefs? The tag is likely not as useful in such a case.
Right. I remember reading this and I cried out loud. Yes.
This is exactly opposite what he's just said. So on the one hand, the tag supposedly is trying to demonstrate that all other worldviews are incoherent, which is not per se what we're saying. And then on the other hand, if we come across a worldview that's a postmodern assortment of beliefs or whatever with no coherency, that's supposed to undermine the usefulness of tag. I don't understand how you square those two claims.
Yeah. I don't know.
So
Conley?
I agree.
Yeah, I'm not going to square things for him. But so here I am. I don't understand a lot of this vocabulary. I don't understand a lot of the proper nouns, right? And so I'd like something to explain those to me, but I'd also like something to explain that explains them in the context of these discussions and debates, right? Name one book that I should read, because as much as I read the theology, it assumes I already know all what these things mean, right? And as much as I read philosophy, I can't connect it well. And I haven't read that much philosophy, so maybe if I did, I would be able to. But could you name one book that I should read after this?
Yes, but you're not going to find it pleasant to obtain. And that is... I
paid a pretty penny for some books before.
Let me grab it. This is a 4-volume set.
I have it.
Yes. Okay, well, good. So that's already solved. You probably got it on sale like I did, hopefully. But yeah, this is 4 volumes, post-Reformation, this is for the sake of the listeners, post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics by Richard A. Muller, I believe is how it's pronounced. And Muller, I think it's Muller. But anyway, this is what all the cool kids are using, including Fesco. And so that's the basis for a lot of the history and the historical claims of historical theology that's out there right now in terms of classical theism and whatnot. As far as the classical theist debate, God Without Parts by James Dolezal. He's got another one, All That's in God.
I read the one you just held up.
Yeah, another one as well. And then Matthew Barrett, who's at Midwestern Seminary, he's writing on some of these topics as well, as far as the classical theism thing. Obviously, Richard Barcelos. But some of that goes back. The reason I mentioned them is not just with regard to the classical theism discussion, but also with regard to who they're using and how they're thinking, because they are relying upon, Thomas and these sorts of things. Read the Summa, right? I mean, read Thomas Aquinas. Yeah. He is great. He's a good guy. He's not a bad guy. Yeah. There are bad things there. I can hear one of our previous contributors at Choosing Hats just absolutely losing it at hearing me say that. But I would read Thomas Aquinas. Again, Michael Sudduth, The Reformed Objection to Natural Theology. I believe
Chris, he said one book.
Yeah, I asked for one book, and your first recommendation was 4 books.
And
then that was followed by like 100 others.
when you're a blogger, I mean, there are lots of things wrong here. When you're a blogger, people are like, "Oh, this guy's just a blogger. He's not academically serious." And you can name one book, right? And then you go off to school, and all these books and much learning. What do they get you? Well, now they want you to go back onto social media to be able to sell your books that you write, and you can no longer recommend just one book. But I would recommend those.
And on that note, I think we should wrap up this episode.
Seriously, just name one. That's the first place for me to start, right? I don't have all the time in the world, just one.
He's asking you.
I would honestly look up what he relies upon the most and go with that. I think that Muller is probably the main source if you want to catch up on the terminology and the names here.
All right, so four books is what you recommend. Okay.
But it's one series.
It's like the Bible is one book, but not. So
I should have just recommended the Bible.
That's the old Presupp standby. Okay, cool. We're going to wrap this up now. And for those of you who are watching this after the fact, you're probably happy that we are wrapping it up. I expect that we'll have Conley back again. We might continue to talk about this, and maybe we'll split it up and talk halvesies between this and Iglesia Ni Cristo, and get into that a little bit as well. So thank you, Conley, for coming on. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thank you, Chris, for showing up.
On time.
On time. I appreciate that. And as usual, if you have enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up on YouTube. Go ahead and subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, we're not moving at the same pace that we were before, but we've got quite a bit of content and we've got a lot coming up. So once again, thank you for being here with us, and we will see you soon.